Let's get started thinking about Thomas Nagel's essay, Death. In further videos, you'll see me going through the text perhaps in a careful way, because you have to. It's that sort of thing. But I think that whenever we're reading anything, especially something like this, which is argumentative, in which the author is trying to establish through argument a certain thesis, it's very important to have an idea of what that thesis is. That's really the first step. What is this author trying to prove? And then we go back and try to figure out how he tries to prove it. And then we think about whether he has actually proven it. Okay, so it's really kind of simple, but somewhat systematic, and it all starts with a clear notion of just what it is that the author is trying to establish. There are a number of, I think, things about Nagel's essay that might take us off track in that first question. What is it that he's trying to establish? And the first thing is the title, which is simply Death, which is, I don't know if it's misleading. Well, yeah, it is misleading because it somehow makes you think that he's trying to write something about the general subject of death, when in fact what he's writing is much more particular than that. That is, he's not trying to somehow say what death is or what its significance is in general for us, what the phenomenon of death is. There's no theory of death here, I think. Rather, it's a particular question that he's trying to answer, and that is why it is that death is in fact bad for the person who dies. So you might think of that as an alternative title, that death is, despite what Epicurus says, a bad, an evil, a misfortune, at least sometimes, for the person who dies. And that is exactly what Nagel is trying to establish here, that when someone dies, something bad can be said, under certain circumstances, to have happened to the person who has died. So Nagel is not trying to establish that death is always a bad thing for the person who dies, and we'll see why, but at least that sometimes it is. And we can see, although Epicurus is never mentioned in this essay, that Epicurus is his real target, because if we know one thing about Epicurus, it's that he believes that death can never, ever be said to be a bad thing for the one who dies. It should also be noted that the question of whether a person's death can be a bad thing for relatives, friends, anyone who cared about that person, is an obvious truth which is irrelevant to this essay, more or less. That is, when we ask whether death is a bad thing, we are ignoring the reality that it could very well be a bad thing, that someone's death could be a bad thing for the living. That is not at issue here. What is particularly at issue here, and is really the question you need to focus on when you're thinking about whether Nagel is successful in what he tries to establish, is that death, again, at least sometimes, and perhaps in the majority of cases, I believe. Well, actually, that's not true. We'll just put that aside for the moment. That death, at least sometimes, can be said to be a bad thing for the person who dies. That is, for the person who no longer exists. And there you can sort of see what the trouble is, right? So I think that's what you need to focus on. That is, that Nagel has to establish that it makes sense, despite Epicurus's thesis about death being nothing to us, that in fact death can be thought of in many cases, if not most, and certainly not all, that death is a bad thing for the person who dies. And the whole success or failure of this essay is determined by how well Nagel establishes the thesis that death, in some cases at least, is a bad for the one who dies. So if you get that straight in your mind, that this is what Nagel is trying to establish, I think that then the essay becomes a little bit easier to comprehend. That is, that's what he's got to prove, and And everything in the essay of real essential importance is relates to that question.